Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the 13th webinar in the Offshore Wind series, Learning from the Experts. I'm Kate McClellan-Press, Senior Project Manager on NYSERDA's Environmental Research Team, and it's my pleasure to be joined by today's expert, Pam Loring with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Before I introduce our speaker, a few reminders for participants and some background on this webinar series. Next slide, please. First, if you are experiencing any technical issues, please contact Sal Graven at the email address on the bottom of this slide. This webinar is being recorded, and the recordings and presentation slides for all webinars in the Learning from the Experts series are available on NYSERDA's website at the address on this slide. All participants have been muted. We will have time for Q&A following the presentation, so please use the Q&A function to submit your questions for the speaker. Next slide, please. New York State is working to advance the responsible and cost-effective development of at least 9,000 megawatts of offshore wind by 2035. Offshore wind is a critical component in achieving the state's goals of 70% renewable sources of electricity by 2030 and 100% zero emissions electricity by 2040. While offshore wind has been providing clean energy to other parts of the world for several decades, this industry is brand new to New Yorkers. To provide interested stakeholders and members of the public with accessible, impartial information and opportunities for engagement on specific topics of interest, NYSERDA is hosting this educational webinar series called Learning from the Experts to connect the public with independent experts in key topics in offshore wind. We endeavor to select Learning from the Experts speakers based on their expertise, not necessarily for an alignment with the opinions of opinions with NYSERDA or the state of New York. If you would like to suggest a topic or speaker for a future webinar, you can email us at offshorewind@nyserda.ny.gov or fill out a survey also available on our website, nyserda.ny.gov, Offshore Wind Webinar Series. Please note that the views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter. Please, next slide. It's now my pleasure to introduce Pam Loring. Pam is a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Migratory Birds. She works on a range of projects related to conservation and management of shorebirds and seabirds with a focus on offshore wind energy. She received a PhD in environmental conservation from the University of Massachusetts Amherst and an MS in biological and environmental sciences from the University of Rhode Island. Thank you so much for joining us, and now I will hand things over to Pam.
Thanks so much, Kate, and thanks to NYSERDA for hosting this event, and thanks everybody for joining today. So this presentation is on coordinated bird monitoring methodologies for offshore wind, and I'll be highlighting a case study from a project that we recently completed with funding from NYSERDA using collaborative radio telemetry to track birds offshore. Next slide. So many different types of birds use offshore environments. These include marine birds that spend most of their lives at sea, and many other taxa, including shorebirds, songbirds, and raptors that fly over the ocean while moving throughout their migratory range. Next slide. Offshore wind is a growing industry in U.S. waters. The map shows current federal lease and planning areas for offshore. These areas overlap broadly with ocean habitat used by many species of marine birds.
Hey, Pam, sorry, we're having a little bit of trouble hearing you, and maybe just come a little bit closer to the computer. I think that might solve the problem.
How's that sound?
Much better, thank you.
Oh, good, okay. Yeah, just let me know if you have any other sound issues. So these federal lease and planning areas overlap broadly with ocean habitat that's used by many species of marine birds. And there's also broad overlap with airspace encompassing the migratory ranges of many bird species within the Atlantic flyway. Next slide. The effects of offshore wind on birds varies by species, habitat alteration, and loss. Displacement of birds from preferred habitats or flight paths, and extinction risk in areas where birds move through the airspace that wind turbines occupy. Next. There's lots of different information that's needed to assess risk, and that includes the species composition of birds within a project area, their distribution and movement patterns, their flight altitude, habitat use, any potential and observed interactions with turbines, and any changes in all of the above pre and post construction. Next slide. Methods for monitoring birds offshore include boat surveys, aerial surveys using observers or cameras, visual-based tracking studies, including radio, satellite, and GPS tagging technologies, passive acoustics, radar, the ocean is a challenging environment for collecting data. It's very remote and it has weather conditions that limit opportunities for direct observation and can really do a number on electronics used for monitoring. These logistical challenges limit methods available for collecting data, especially at night when many species are migrating offshore and during inclement weather when collision risks are elevated due to reduced visibility. It's also a highly dynamic environment with variation in species and habitat conditions across space and time. And there are various spatial and temporal trade-offs with technologies and methods that are currently available for monitoring birds offshore. Next slide. To address these trade-offs, multiple methods should be used to collect complementary information. For example, combining radar and cameras to look at movement patterns and species of birds. And coordination across sites, studies, and cooperators is critical for maximizing information gains. Next slide. So next, I'm going to present automated radio telemetry effort that's underway as a case study of how a coordinated approach can be used to maximize technology and information gains. Automated radio telemetry involves tagging animals with lightweight radio tags and using receiving stations with antennas and data loggers to collect movement data on tagged animals. The data are then processed and used for research and conservation, and the radio tags are very small and lightweight, starting at about 1/10 of a gram, so they can be used to track a variety of species of birds, bats, and insects. Next slide. Motus Wildlife Tracking System is an international collaborative research network that uses cooperative automated radio telemetry to track tagged animals on shared frequencies. Collaborators using Motus have collectively tagged tens of thousands of birds and bats and tracked their movements using an international. Motus also serves as a hub for data from thousands of receiving stations and tagged animals worldwide, representing hundreds of species. Next slide. These maps show some example data from Motus. The map on the left shows locations of Motus stations in North America, shown as the yellow points. The map on the right shows movement data from hundreds of shorebirds tracked with Motus, with lines representing interpolated tracks between stations where birds were detected. You can see from the station map that there's a pretty extensive coverage of towers along the Atlantic coast, but coverage is lacking offshore. So the interpolations of offshore movements have a lot of underlying uncertainty. And this uncertainty could be improved by using Motus technology in offshore environments. Next slide. There are several opportunities that come with using Motus offshore. Offshore Motus stations can provide continuous monitoring of offshore wind project areas. There is potential to assess cumulative exposure across wind project areas with a network of offshore stations. Coordinating with the Motus network makes it possible to monitor large sample sizes of tagged birds and bats and through the extensive network of stations. And all the data are centralized through Motus with metadata standards and workflows that facilitate data quality, consistency, and accessibility. Next slide. There are also some challenges with using Motus offshore. These include that deploying Motus stations on offshore infrastructure, such as turbines and buoys, can be logistically challenging with weather conditions, site access, space limitations, and other factors. For the technology to be effective, it requires consistent deployment and operation across industry projects and partners, so there's a large coordination component involved. There can also be challenges with timely data transfer from offshore sites, depending on the availability of internet or cellular coverage. And for monitoring to be effective, there needs to be tagged birds and bats from target species and populations of interest, rather than relying on opportunistic data from birds and bats tagged by unrelated efforts that happen to fly by, which is a great bonus of Motus, but does not make the best use of the technology for addressing specific information gaps. So a strategic approach is needed to deploy stations and tags effectively to collect data in offshore environments. Next. To help meet this need, NYSERDA funded a project that aimed to improve the way that Motus technology is coordinated and used for applications. This project is titled Development of Monitoring Protocols and Guidance for Automated Radio Telemetry Studies at Offshore Wind Farms. It was conducted over a 2-year period, beginning in 2020 and wrapping up at the end. Next. The project was led cooperatively by the Fish and Wildlife Service, Biodiversity Research Institute, the University of Rhode Island, and Birds Canada. The co-leads are listed here, and I'd just like to take a moment to thank the team and acknowledge all of the great collaboration, creative thinking, and multi. Next slide. The overall project goal was to develop standardized protocols for using Motus to monitor birds. Next slide. Some of our main objectives were to strategically increase the coverage of offshore stations in the U.S. Atlantic, coordinate tag deployment efforts, help make automated radio telemetry a consistent component of offshore monitoring plans, and improve our understanding of the offshore movements and habitat use of many bird and bat species in the U.S. Atlantic by leveraging the collaborative infrastructure of the Motus network. Next slide. Project team developed a series of interrelated products to guide and inform the deployment of Motus for offshore wind applications in the U.S. Atlantic. The overall project includes the following components: a guidance document with specifications and workflows for offshore Motus stations, an online study design tool that allows users to map detection coverage from stations offshore, a simulation study to model animal movement data through offshore arrays, a Motus data framework, including a centralized portal for data management, coordination, and summary reports, and a monitoring framework to help guide tagging efforts and study design for offshore Motus projects. The products were developed through strong stakeholder input, including input from a cross-sector project advisory committee, and through a series of stakeholder workshops to introduce each draft product and generate feedback through discussions and breakout groups. So next, I'll provide an overview of each product. Next slide. So the guidance document contains detailed information on technical specifications and operation of Motus stations on offshore wind turbines and buoys, as well as detailed workflows to guide and standardize station deployment protocols. It also includes appendices, field data sheets, and field reference manuals for station operation and calibration. The document was developed collaboratively with our cross-sector project advisory committee, including industry, agency, and NGO representatives. And it was informed by fieldwork we conducted at Block Island and in coordination with several buoy deployments by partners throughout the US Atlantic. Next slide. As part of this effort, we conducted a pilot study on Block Island to develop and field test protocols for the guidance document in coordination with the University of Rhode Island and Block Island Wind Farm. We set up 2 Motus stations on Block Island overlooking the wind farm and set up a tracking station on the easternmost turbine at the wind farm using draft equipment specifications and protocols from the guidance document. The map on the left shows locations of our tracking stations as well as nearby Motus stations on Long Island that were active during data collection. And the Block Island wind farm is shown as the blue point on the map. The map also shows some of the additional offshore wind lease areas in federal waters of Rhode Island Sound. And the photo on the right shows Motus stations, mounted on a turbine at Block Island Wind Farm. The station used the recommended configuration of 4 directional antennas and 1 omnidirectional antenna mounted to a dedicated mast on the corner of the turbine platform with clear line of sight to the surrounding ocean. Next slide. This photo shows the view from the top of one of our land-based stations on Block Island, overlooking the wind turbines in the distance. The directional antenna has a clear line of sight to the surrounding airspace and ocean, which is critically important for the technology to work effectively. Next slide. To test the detection range and coverage of our stations, we conducted a series of calibration surveys. The surveys involve flying a test tag that's co-located with a barometric GPS unit around the vicinity of active Motus stations. This photo is of Eric Carlson, a PhD student in astrophysics at the University of Rhode Island, with a kite that has a Motus tag attached to it. We flew the kite behind the boat within detection range of the Block Island stations to collect calibration data that Eric is using to develop models of antenna beam coverage from the stations. Next slide. This slide shows photos from calibration surveys that we conducted at different altitudes. The photo on the left shows a kite with a GPS that we flew behind our boat at altitudes up to 130 feet above sea level. The photo on the right was taken during an aerial calibration survey flown in partnership with the Rhode Island Civil Air Patrol at altitudes up to 1,500 feet. There is generally a positive relationship between tag altitude and detection ranges of stations, so it's important to collect calibration data across a range of flight altitudes to understand station coverage for tracking species that fly at different flight heights. Next slide. So this slide shows results from one of our kite surveys around the wind farm. The map on the right shows GPS and detection data from the tagged kite during the survey. Both the test tag and the GPS were collecting data every second, so the data had very high temporal resolution. 56% of the tag pings from the kite were detected during the survey by at least one of the 3 Block Island stations. Detection data from the turbine station are shown on the map in blue. And we had some additional detections from Motus stations on eastern Long Island that were 30 to 50 kilometers away. Next slide. This slide shows results from an aerial survey that we conducted in partnership with Rhode Island Civil Air Patrol. These surveys were flown at altitudes up to 1,500 feet above sea level. The images on the slide show data along the transect every second and the number of receivers that detected the tagged plane at each point simultaneously. The maps show that given where the survey coverage took place, there were up to 5 receivers detecting the tagged plane at the same time, including the 3 stations at Block Island and the 2 stations in eastern Long Island Sound. Eric Carlson is using these data as part of his dissertation in the physics department at the University of Rhode Island to develop models to map antenna beam patterns from Motus stations and to develop triangulation methods for modeling flight paths of birds through Motus arrays. Next slide. Andrew Gilbert at Biodiversity Research Institute incorporated the antenna beam models into an online study design tool called IDIOMS, which stands for Informing the Design and Implementation of Offshore Motus Systems. The tool is available as an Shiny app and helps users optimize numbers and locations of Motus stations within a lease area by mapping estimated coverage from the antenna beams. It also allows users to simulate seabird and shorebird tracks to estimate proportions of individuals detected by the simulated array. The simulation work was led by Evan Adams from BRI and is described in a manuscript that's currently out for review. Results from the tool are summarized in automated reports that contain key information on study design that can be included as standardized elements in post-construction monitoring plans. Next slide. Study products also include a Motus data framework to coordinate information among projects for offshore wind applications. The framework was developed in collaboration with programmers from Birds Canada that operate the Motus database. It includes new workflows and tools to coordinate and disseminate detection data, metadata, and summary reports from all tagged animals and Motus stations deployed for offshore wind energy applications in the US Atlantic. Next slide. So this slide shows some example data from the new Motus Explore data dashboard that was developed concurrently with the framework. Tracking data are from a peregrine falcon tagged on Block Island with Biodiversity Research Institute as part of this effort. The falcon was detected by all 3 of the Block Island stations and by a station on eastern Long Island as it departed, and was subsequently detected by a Motus station in Florida. So the dashboard makes it easy to summarize detection data, metadata, and produce automated reports. It's currently in a beta form and being updated by Motus to improve functionality and applications for visualizing, summarizing, and reporting data across projects. Next slide. So lastly, we developed a monitoring framework that intends to provide a roadmap for using Motus offshore. Monitoring framework includes various workflows and recommendations to standardized methods for site-specific monitoring and reporting, coordinate information across sites for regional scale, develop centralized tag deployment strategies to facilitate population-level inferences from individual-based tracking data, identify standardized data analysis methods to address high-priority information needs, facilitate regional coordination opportunities to maximize resources, and recommend high-priority future actions identified during the framework development, including improved workflows, analysis tools, and integration with other avian and bat monitoring technologies. Next slide. Products are now available on a dedicated page on motus.org. URL is on the slide, and we can also put it in the chat. And the products are intended to...
We missed that last point.
The living documents.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the products are intended to be living documents that are updated as new information and technology becomes available. And if Kate, if you could put that URL in the chat too, that would be great, or we could send it around after the webinar. Next slide. we're currently coordinating with developers and BOEM to implement Offshore Motus recommendations into monitoring plans for offshore wind farms. And we're coordinating with stakeholders through the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative. Recommendation. Science plans. Next slide. Current efforts also include a collaboration with Dominion Energy at their coastal Virginia offshore wind project. So Dominion worked with Normando to set up 2 Motus stations on their offshore wind turbines. The stations are field testing a split mast antenna configuration that was designed for deployment on turbines with circular platforms where the 4 directional antennas per station are split between 2 masts on opposite ends of the turbine tower. Next slide. This summer, Dominion is funding a study using Motus to track movements of piping plovers tagged at nesting areas along the eastern shore of Maryland and Virginia. The plan is to tag 25 adult piping plovers with Motus tags. The field efforts are led by Katie Walker and Kevin Holcomb from Chincoteague National Wildlife Refuge, with partners from the Nature Conservancy, Assateague National Seashore, Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources, and Virginia Tech Shorebird Program. Next slide. We are also continuing to advance the science of Project WOW. So this is a large multi-partner study led by Duke University and funded by DOE and BOEM to evaluate the effects of offshore wind development on wildlife in the U.S. Atlantic. Next slide. Project WOW includes Motus components that are led by Biodiversity Research Institute. The plans include to update the existing network of Motus stations on Block Island, conduct calibration surveys to refine methods and models, including double and GPS tags and the use of drones, field testing new antenna design for offshore stations, informing model development for estimating 3D flight paths of birds from Motus data, and publishing results in a peer-reviewed journal. Next slide. I'd like to thank the project team, NYSERDA, and our many partners for making this work possible. And thanks everybody for joining today. Please feel free to connect with me via email if you'd like any additional information or to coordinate efforts. And I'm happy to take it.
Thanks, Pam. I really appreciate that talk, and I would encourage folks that have questions to use the Q&A function to submit them. And we have plenty of time for discussion, which is great. And we have a lot of really good questions already. Pam, I don't know if you could describe a little bit about how offshore wind developers have been involved in these efforts, and also kind of why they need to be involved in this coordination. There are some questions around like both pre-construction and post-construction monitoring, and how work like this can inform their monitoring efforts at the project level.
Sure, yeah. So the efforts to date that we have conducted with industry partners have really focused on field testing the technology, field testing protocols and workflows for deployment, and making sure that our plans on paper match logistics of working in marine environments. So making sure that everything's weatherized, waterproofed, transferring data to land consistently, and providing detection ranges and detection probabilities that are of sufficient quality for offshore monitoring. So that's taken a lot of trial and error, both with turbine-based stations and with buoy-based stations. So our guidance documents developed over the past 2 years have really tried to incorporate the best information that we've learned through these field tests with partners. And then there were a few other parts of that question. Was one of them how developers can support these efforts moving forward?
That you discussed, and what is their role in these things going forward?
Okay, great. That was a little bit choppy on my end where it like paused and froze and then got really fast, but I'll just hit a couple of those key components. So ways that offshore wind developers can help support these efforts include deploying and calibrating receiving stations on offshore turbines and buoys within their project areas, following the specifications and protocols in our Offshore Motus guidance. There's also an ongoing need to support data fees and maintenance of nearby priority coastal stations that make up the Motus network at large, so that we have good information on where birds are moving in coastal environments that can be paired with information from offshore sites. There's a need for coordinating tagging efforts for species of interest across many partners, including different offshore wind projects and other researchers from other entities. And Motus really works the best when everyone follows the established guidelines for full transparency of data through the Motus database. So there's a great database set up to coordinate information at a network level. So following those guidelines for data coordination are critical to making Motus work effectively. Any other questions that came through?
Yeah, hi Pam, this is Jana Herndon with NYSERDA. I'm a project manager on the offshore wind team. And since Kate has lost her connection, I'm happy to pose some more questions we've received from the audience. We have a number of questions here about Motus. Does Motus provide 3D data or just detections?
Motus provides very detailed data on it's at the detection level. So it's receiving antenna that receives the radio signal, timestamp, which is synchronized through GPS. So all the different stations have GPS time that's synchronized. You have a signal strength value that relates to how strong the signal is, which can be correlated with how close the animal is to the station. And you have a bearing from the antenna. So you have directionality if you're using Yagi antennas. And then you have the animal ID, which is linked to metadata through the Motus network. So you have all the station metadata, you have all the animal metadata, and then you have the detection information. So that's kind of the most basic level of information that Motus provides. From there have been different efforts to triangulate on animal positions using simultaneous detections from different antenna beams that are detecting the same animal at the same time. And there's also been some work to estimate altitudes coarsely of animals in flight, because there's a relationship with how far away an animal can be detected from a tracking station and how high it's flying. So higher flying birds have greater distances to which they can be detected. So if you have multiple stations that are spatially separated, detecting the same bird at the same time, you can use that relationship between the distance of the stations to estimate coarsely the height of the bird. But the position estimation and flight height is an ongoing area of research that's incredibly challenging. And it's something that we're working in collaboration with some physicists from University of Rhode Island, Doug Gobet and Eric Carlson, to try to sort of crack that nut as part of Project WOW moving forward.
Great, thank you, Pam. I'll ask just one more follow-up question, and then I'll turn it back over to Kate. I think you addressed this partially in your last response, but if there's anything else you want to add about how Motus can fit into overall monitoring, including survey data and other sensor data like avian radar.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's different ways that it could fit depending on the phase of development. So in the pre-construction phase, when there's no turbine infrastructure in the water, Motus can be deployed on buoys, but in a pretty limited capacity. So buoys tend to be small relative to turbines, and they have a lot of wave action. So the wave action makes it challenging to use directional antennas because there's too much motion. So we recommend that people use an omnidirectional antenna, which is like a whip antenna that gives presence absence information and also has more limited detection range relative to directional antennas. So you might have information on birds and bats passing through the airspace of that buoy within about 1 kilometer. So pretty basic presence absence information during pre-construction, but it still provides a way to get some species composition, numbers, and timing of presence in lease areas that are hard to obtain otherwise, especially at night where you can't do visual-based surveys or use detailed cameras as effectively. So during the construction and operation phases, when stations are able to be installed on turbines, then you can use larger directional antennas that have better range, and you can have multiple stations. So by having multiple stations with directional antennas, you increase your detection range and coverage of the site that you're monitoring. And you also get more information on the flight paths of birds flying through the array because the antennas are directional and it can tell you how they're coming and going. So that opens up more opportunities for data analysis to look at, flight paths, if they're flying through the wind turbine array versus around the array. And I think future efforts to really try to pair Motus data with radar technology and other types of complementary technologies could be really powerful, but we're not quite there yet in implementation.
Great, thank you so much. Kate, are you back with us or have you lost connection again? Okay, not hearing her, I'm happy to pose more questions from the audience, and thank you for those who continue to submit questions. Let's see. We have a lot of questions here. Efforts are underway to use radar to study broader scale migratory activity in the offshore space in the Gulf of Mexico. Is there any discussion about a similar effort in the Atlantic?
Not to my knowledge with specific plans for implementation, but there have been discussions about monitoring methods in general and how different methods could be complementary. If folks have more information on specific ways that people are planning to use radar and Motus that I might not be aware of, then definitely feel free to put it in the chat. I think it's a really good opportunity, but it's hasn't quite been dove into yet in the Atlantic.
And another spatial question, is anything planned that would extend this work into the Gulf of Maine?
Yeah, so the Gulf of Maine has some offshore wind kind of areas that are under consideration now for delineation. And I think there is some interest in potentially doing some buoy-based stations or doing some stations on other infrastructure that could be offshore in the Gulf of Maine that could support Motus stations. I'm not directly involved in any of those efforts, but it would be, a great place to kind of build out the network. There's been some really neat work that's happened over the last decade using stations on islands in the Gulf of Maine to track passerines and shorebirds and other species. And I think that could be kind of revived and built out a little bit more in this offshore context.
Great, thank you. Back to another question about Motus data, and if you already answered this, just let me know. Are there any methods to extrapolate Motus data to estimate flux or the magnitude of individuals and species that might pass through the receivers and the rotor swept area?
Yes. So that gets into like some of the collision risk modeling components. We do have a project now with Biodiversity Research Institute that is using Motus data that were collected previously through studies that we conducted on piping plover, roseate tern, and red knot to look at doing collision risk assessments. The data had previously been collected using only coastal stations. So we're trying to work out some methods now to look at offshore movements with that like limited data from the coastal stations that have been collected previously. But I think now that there's more offshore stations coming online, the opportunities to be able to calculate flux and look at passage rates and things like that are going to be increasing. And I should mention too that that work is funded by WOW.
Great, thank you for that answer. A general question here, what are the regulatory requirements for this data?
So to my knowledge, there have been two records of decision for the two wind farms that have gone through the entire permitting process that both had Motus as part of their monitoring components. So there's some information in the ROD that will kind of provide a little bit more context on the use of Motus and the data availability, but I can't recall off the top of my head what the specifics are.
Okay, great. And I'm not sure if this question was veering in a slightly different direction. A follow-up is it mostly U.S. Fish and Wildlife / state endangered species regulations? Maybe it's speaking to how the data is collected.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what that question is sort of looking to address specifically. So we have done studies on listed species, piping plover, red knot, and roseate tern to learn more about their offshore movements to help inform different types of assessments. But one thing that's really unique about Motus is that it can be used on really any species of birds and bats because the tags are so small. And the sample sizes and species that are tagged are leveraged by the collaborative network. So even though we have studies that might be focused on ESA's listed species, by having stations on turbines and buoys, you get access to the data of any species that flies by. So that's kind of like bonus data. And I know that there's a lot of interest in tagging non-listed species as well. So it's certainly not just limited to ESA listed species, but those have been a big focus given their regulatory importance.
Thank you. How many tags need to be deployed to provide useful data on bird movements?
That's a great question. The short answer is more tags are generally better as long as they're strategically deployed across sites so that they're sampling from target populations in a way that's representative. I'll give a shout out to Juliet Lamb from the Nature Conservancy, who did a power analysis on Motus data and published the results in a really nice article that looks at sample sizes and populations sampled with existing Motus data to make recommendations on when, where, and how many birds to sample. So we can try to put the link to that paper in the chat.
Great, thank you, Pam. I think that you touched upon the availability of the data a bit in your presentation, but here's a follow-up question. How will this data be made available to commercial interests such as airlines, investors, NGOs?
So Motus data have different levels of access. And there's kind of a basic level of data that are available publicly through their website on motus.org. So anybody can go to motus.org, click on the different stations, pull up tables and plots of data that those stations have collected from individually tagged birds and bats, and then click on the birds and bats to learn more about where they've moved previously. Those data are at the daily timescale, and there are more detailed data that provide like every single ping of the tag from each antenna that it was detected on. Those data sets can be very rich, millions and millions of records, and can be accessible through motus.org with permission from the study PIs. So we have more information about data types and availability and access in our guidance documents that came out. If folks look at the Motus data framework, they can get the information on that, and it links to the Motus collaboration policy. But the short answer is it's very open data, and it's very collaborative. So if there's interest in accessing detailed detection data, usually that's possible by connecting with PIs.
Great, thank you, Pam. Can anyone make a Motus station to detect tagged birds?
Yes, great question. So there's many different ways to make a Motus station. A few key things are having a receiver. So there's a couple different types of receivers that work for Motus, and having antennas that are listening for the right frequency. So there's two frequencies in North America, 434 megahertz and 166 megahertz. So all of our stations have antennas for each frequency. And then a way to get the antennas in the air so they have good detection range. So that could be on a mast or on a something mounted to a roof of a building. There's lots of different kind of ways to do it. So the best source of information is motus.org if folks are looking to set up a Motus station, especially on land. And then for any offshore stations, those require some special configurations because of the offshore environment and to try to get consistent kind of standardized detection probability across sites. So for any offshore Motus stations, we recommend going to our Atlantic Offshore Wind page to look at those specific recommendations.
Thank you. And I think you spoke a little bit to this question in your answer, but would it be possible to deploy Motus on a larger, slow-moving cargo ship?
Good. Yeah, we've looked into that a little bit. We've had a couple stations on ferries, and then we had one on a whale watching boat. And they can get some data. It's a little bit more challenging because it's a moving platform. So you have to take the boat's kind of speed and track and the area that it's covering into consideration when you're analyzing the data, which can make things a little bit extra challenging. And they also can be a little bit limited on where you can set up antennas and what types of antennas you can use. So we tried on the ferries, we first tried an omnidirectional antenna that was mounted to the top of the ferry. And it's basically listening for tags in kind of the circular radius surrounding the antenna. And we ended up with a lot of interference from other like antennas and radio equipment on the boat. So we were getting pretty swamped out with radio noise, and it was harder for it to detect tags that might be flying around kind of in the ocean. So we've a little bit moved away from using Motus on boats, but I think there are some opportunities there that people could look into that could work under certain circumstances for certain applications.
Great, thank you. Another question, what analysis models are used to extrapolate the data from smaller turbines to larger turbines?
I don't know that I fully understand that question. It might be getting at like flight heights of birds, because usually larger turbines have like a taller rotor swept area. So that really requires like more detailed flight height information to try to understand kind of risk windows relative to turbine size. Getting flight height data for Motus is really challenging, and there's a lot of uncertainty in the flight height estimations. So other technologies like GPS with a barometric sensor for accuracy, or using radar or another type of flight height method might be more appropriate.
Great, thank you. Question here, do you see the back-end false positive identifications improving?
Yeah, so this is like a Motus technical question. So sometimes, so the tags have codes, which allow thousands of different tags to be uniquely identified on a single radio frequency. But sometimes codes can come from other radio noises, like the ferry is a really good example, where we had this omnidirectional antenna that was listening to stuff close to the boat, and the boat had a lot of other radio equipment on it. So we were constantly getting code 5, for example. And then when we submitted the data to Motus, sometimes we would get a lot of different birds that had code 5 in the network. And you'd look at the data and be like, oh, there's no way that like Indiana bat with code 5, you know, came from the Midwest out to this ferry and then went back to the Midwest. So sometimes you get these false positives. Motus has a pretty good algorithm for doing a coarse filter of the data to try to get rid of as many false positives as possible before it goes online. But it's really up to the tag PIs to vet their data, flag anything that might be publicly facing that they know is wrong, and then Motus will remove it. So when people flag their data with known false positives, it helps Motus improve their algorithms. So it's kind of like this feedback system. So it's really good to flag your data if you have false positives and to report those to Motus. There is another frequency now that's newer, 434 megahertz, that has a different tag coding system. That one seems to be a little bit more robust to false positives relative to the other frequency, 166. So hopefully that will help improve things moving forward too.
Thank you. Another follow-up question from the same person. We updated with the CTT receiver. Could you explain how this is being used and the main benefits of using this receiver?
Okay, so this is a question about, there's like different computers that you can put at your Motus station for detecting birds and logging information from the antennas. So this person is using a receiver that allows for 166 megahertz and 434 megahertz to be monitored simultaneously. So this is actually the receiver that we're currently recommending for offshore stations, because we think it's important to have coverage for both frequencies in the network in order to maximize the sample size of individuals that you're monitoring, and to have more options for tag technologies. So that's one benefit of that particular receiver, is that it allows you to listen to both frequencies. Another benefit is that it has some unique options for basically remotely accessing data. So it has a cellular option that works really well in cell range. It has Wi-Fi and Ethernet connectivity, and then it also has some limited satellite internet through Iridium as well to send summary information. So from the offshore sites, it's really important to know if stations are working or not, because often they're only visited every 3 months or so, depending on site logistics. So it's great to be able to log into your computer and see remotely whether it's online or offline, or if there's a power issue. So that's one benefit of that receiver, is that it has a few more options for remote connectivity.
Great, thank you. I have a couple of questions which I think are related here. One is, when and how long should offshore stations be deployed and maintained? And then sort of the second part to that is, using the technology available, when will we know how bird populations are being impacted and if additional mitigation measures are required?
Okay, so I'll tackle the first one. So we recommend that offshore turbine stations are deployed during the construction phase of the wind facility and then operated through the lifetime of the project, which really helps to address priorities for consistent and long-term monitoring data. Technology is obviously advancing, constantly, so it's good to revisit, is this technology still relevant periodically? But it's been around now for a while. It's collected lots of new information on many, many different species, and it's growing. So we think it's a good choice for being like a consistent component of monitoring plans. And to have that long-term data is really valuable for monitoring changes over time. So the second part of the question was kind of more of an impact. Can you repeat that, please?
Yes, using the technology currently available, when will it be known how bird populations are being impacted and if additional mitigation measures are required?
Yeah, so that's a pretty broad question. So it's challenging to monitor birds offshore because of all the logistical factors. And there are a lot of bird populations that could occur in offshore environments. Seabirds that, spend their whole lives practically at sea, to, migratory songbirds that might migrate through twice a year, northbound and southbound, flying at night where they're hard to detect. So we're always going to be dealing with some level of uncertainty when it comes to risk. And I think the best thing that we can do is try to learn as much as we can, which really, highlights the need for long-term monitoring using the best available technology. And through that, having kind of these adaptive plans to address risks as we learn more about them.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question before I wrap us up. With the addition of a third frequency, would a third mast and antenna be required?
Good question. That would depend, I think. So this is getting a little bit into like radio physics questions. I think it would depend in part on the frequency. So if it was really close to one of the existing frequencies, my guess is that existing antennas could be used that would potentially overlap that frequency band and be able to monitor like 434 megahertz and 436 megahertz pretty effectively. If it was a frequency that was far outside of the existing frequency bands that we're monitoring, then you might need an additional antenna. But I think it would be prudent to really weigh the pros and cons of adding another frequency into Motus before that gets implemented.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Pam, for your very detailed responses to some very technical and thoughtful questions. If we could move to the closing slide, please, Sal, I will wrap us up by thanking our audience for joining us for this Learning from the Experts webinar. Just a reminder that the webinar recording and the presentation slides will be available on NYSERDA's website. Registration information for future webinars in this series will be posted on our website as well. The next webinar in the series is on Wednesday, May 10th. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, will discuss offshore wind reviews under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. Please visit wind.ny.gov to register. If you have requests for future topics you'd like to hear about in this series, please email us at offshore-wind@nyserda.ny.gov or fill out our Learning from the Experts survey posted on our website. Thank you to our speaker, thank you, Pam, and thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next time.
Thanks so much.